I now give the floor to the representative of the United States. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you, Mr. President, and on behalf of the United States, I congratulate Algeria on your presidency and extend a warm welcome, as you did, Mr. President, to the new members who have joined us today: Denmark, Greece, Pakistan, Panama, and Somalia. Thank you, High Commissioner Turk, Representative Pieperkorn, and Dr. Haj Hassan for your powerful briefings. Colleagues, throughout this conflict, Hamas has repeatedly misused civilian infrastructure, like schools and hospitals, to store caches of weapons, house fighters, and coordinate attacks against Israel. Hamas continues day in and day out to put civilians in harm's way through their tactics and use of these facilities. I urge colleagues in this room to criticize Hamas for these actions and call them out for continuing to put Palestinian civilians in Gaza in the crosshairs. Far too many still cannot bring themselves to do so. Israel's fight is with Hamas and not the Palestinian civilians the terrorist group falsely purports to represent. According to the Israel Defense Forces, over 240 fighters were apprehended at the Kamal Adwan Hospital, including 15 individuals who participated in the October 7th massacre. Even as it battles Hamas, Israel has a moral imperative to prevent civilian harm. We don't want to see hospitals as scenes of violence. No one benefits, least of all the civilians who neither started this conflict nor have the means to end it, and desperately need medical attention. Civilians cannot be left without functioning hospitals or adequate medical care. It is vital for Israel to comply with international humanitarian law and to take every possible step to prevent civilian harm, notably as it relates to patients receiving care at Kamal Adwan Hospital and medical professionals dedicated to treating the population. And with regard to reports about the director of Kamal Adwan Hospital, we in the United States government are in contact with the Israeli government and partners on the ground and are gathering information. Colleagues, far too many civilians in Gaza are hungry, without medication, clean drinking water, or adequate housing. Secretary Blinken has repeatedly emphasized we need to end the conflict, bring the hostages home, including the 7 Americans held by Hamas, and chart a path forward in the post-conflict period that provides governance, security, and reconstruction in Gaza. We must also immediately surge humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians throughout Gaza, or many will not survive the rest of the winter. And we have made clear to Israel that they must do more to address these preventable humanitarian shortfalls. We have been explicit about the specific steps we need to see Israel take, including surging the entry of food, medicine, and other essential supplies into Gaza, knowing that winter is here. There must be no forcible displacement, nor policy of starvation in Gaza, which would have grave implications under both U.S. and international law. We need to see a surge in humanitarian aid delivered immediately. Only a sustained flow of assistance, food, clean water, medical supplies into Gaza will bring relief and address catastrophic levels of food insecurity. Colleagues, the work before us to forge a ceasefire remains difficult. The challenge of helping a revitalized Palestinian Authority rebuild Gaza without Hamas is immense. And yet, we first need to address the immediacy of the humanitarian situation, because lives are at stake, the lives of Palestinian civilians in Gaza and the lives of the hostages who have suffered mightily since Hamas initiated this horrific conflict on October 7th. We need to give Palestinians a future to look forward to with self-determination, dignity, and security. We need Israel to feel secure within its own borders. The United States continues to push for a ceasefire and hostage release deal that allows for a surge in life-saving assistance to Palestinian civilians. There are simply no alternatives that lead to durable peace and regional calm. Thank you.
I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин
Mr. President, we welcome you as president, and we wish you every success over the course of your presidency. We also welcome the new elected members of the Security Council of the United Nations. Mr. President, we support the initiative of the delegation of Algeria to convene today's Security Council meeting to discuss the deteriorating situation in the Gaza Strip amid the IDF military operation, which has been ongoing for 15 months and counting on the occupied Palestinian territory. We thank the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, the World Health Organization representative for the occupied Palestinian territory, Dr. Rick Peppercorn, for their briefings. And we wish to separately thank Madam Dr. Tanya Haj Hassan for her elucidating testimony, for her courageous and frank description and testament to the horror that is being endured by medical personnel, patients, including children in Gaza. We plan to request a separate meeting of the Security Council dedicated to the topic of children in Gaza, which our Western colleagues unfortunately prefer not to notice for the advancement of other, more beneficial from their standpoint, topics. Mr. President, we are gravely concerned at Israel's ongoing shelling and bombardment of civilian objects on the territory of the Gaza Strip. Every week from North Gaza, there are reports about airstrikes on refugee and IDP camps. Amid the hostilities and the blockades imposed by West Jerusalem, in the Gaza Strip, a genuine humanitarian catastrophe has broken out, and this is compounded by large-scale hunger, outbreaks of communicable diseases, and devastation of vital infrastructure. Refugees and persons repeatedly displaced is close to millions. The leadership of UNRWA forewarned us about the imminent famine in the Gaza Strip, given the insufficiency of humanitarian assistance being provided. The Israeli strikes frequently target medical facilities. Furthermore, we have every reason to believe that Israeli troops who are bent on inflicting collective punishment on Gaza have been systematically destroying the health system of the Strip. For the bombardment, artillery strikes, the cleansing and setting of fires on hospital complexes are now a daily occurrence. On an almost a weekly basis, there are reports from Kamal Adwan Hospital and Al Adwa Hospital, as well as the Indonesian hospital, and which since the 21st of December, they have effectively become targets for Tzahhal's military operations. Attacks, devastation, and evacuation orders for patients of these institutions has resulted in the fact that the residents in the northern regions that are besieged, who are already effectively entrapped, have now been left completely without medical treatment and services. The Indonesian hospital, which provided assistance to thousands of Gazans, no longer functions. Half of Al Avda hospital has been destroyed, and a spate of Israeli strikes on Kamal Adwan hospital, that is the last major medical institution in the region. These attacks and strikes have completely rendered it unoperational and threatened the lives of 75,000 Palestinians. This inevitably understandably gives rise to grave concern vis-a-vis the plight and the fate of those residents of Gaza who are counting on medical assistance. Under these circumstances, the Director General of the World Health Organization, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, whom, as we all remember well, just a few days ago, by some miracle, survived an Israeli strike on Sana'a airport in Yemen, announced that Gaza's health sector is under serious threat. And he called upon the Israeli authorities to cease attacks on medical institutions, as well as to release the leaders and medical personnel of Kamal Adwan Hospital who were detained during the Israeli military operation. However, this call clearly fell on deaf ears in West Jerusalem. The distinctive response there was an Israeli airstrike on the Baptist hospital in Al-Ahli, as a result of which at least 7 people died and dozens were wounded. The inhumanity of Israel's action, Israel, which relies on the unconditional and reserved support of Washington, is becoming all the more clear, given that the hospital attacks in the north of the enclave, that before those attacks, 14,000 people required medical evacuation, including children, women, and persons with disabilities. Where are people to flee how can people flee when they cannot do so physically? Or perhaps Israeli authorities who provide medical evacuation and send those patients for treatment in their country? Nope. No, unfortunately. We have not observed any such action on the part of Israel, and we have not seen any indication of West Jerusalem's interest to resolve these issues through cooperation with the United Nations and the ICRC. On the contrary, the activities of humanitarian organizations working on the ground is being obstructed with movement restrictions and prohibitions on the entry of humanitarian assistance. On the whole, this is all geared towards the achievement of a single objective, namely to cleanse the Gaza Strip from the maximum number of Palestinians residing there and to create conditions unfit for human survival. In this context, we note that we fully support the intention of the WHO to organize an urgent mission to the north of the Strip in order to attempt to transfer critically ill patients to the south of Gaza, where for now certain minimal conditions do still exist for the delivery of the necessary medical assistance. We call upon the Israeli authorities to immediately cease hostilities and to provide for normal operations for those few medical institutions who, for the moment, are still capable of receiving patients. And this is approximately 15 of the previously 36 operational hospitals. Distinguished colleagues, hospitals must not become battlefields. They may not be used for military purposes, and medical workers need to have opportunities to unimpededly fulfill their civilian duty and their moral.
которые лежат
The core principles which lie at the very heart of modern international humanitarian law. What is taking place right now constitutes an egregious violation of the methods and rules of warfare, and this must be put to an end. Peaceful civilians trapped in the conflict need to be provided for with food and the right to medical assistance. And of course, parties to conflict have an obligation to protect those who save lives, namely medical workers. In Gaza, 1,417 medical institutional staff have already been murdered. These are shocking figures. Mr. President, we all understand that the ongoing suffering of civilians in the Gaza Strip will continue at the minimum until there's an end put to the ruthless military operation of the IDF, which is being carried out without any consideration for the opinion of the entire international community. The conditions for this will not emerge while Washington continues to provide political cover for Israel, and it continues to block any relevant steps and initiatives by the UN Security Council, and as it continues to funnel weapons into West Jerusalem. And these are weapons which continue to cause the deaths of civilians in in the Gaza Strip, we believe that the membership of the Security Council must not remain indifferent to the situation that is tarnishing the reputation of the Security Council. There's a need to continue to attempt to awaken the conscience of our colleagues, to convey to them the importance of abandonment of advancement of parochial, one-sided schemes for reconciling Israel with its neighbors without taking into account the need for a fair solution, a just solution to the Palestinian issue on the basis of a framework agreed upon by the United Nations. That is the well-known. What is exceedingly unseemly is the U.S. tactic of dragging out the time for the benefit of Israel and their imposition upon the Council of support for negotiations that have been unsuccessfully ongoing for more than 6 months with Washington's mediation to reach a deal between Israel and Hamas. As we are all perfect. Authorities of West Jerusalem authorities, time after time, place before us one new condition after another new condition for the achievement of agreement on a ceasefire and exchange of hostages, abandoning even the dubious schemes which have been enshrined in Resolution 2735. At the same time, responsibility for the derailment of this U.S. deal time after time is pinned on Hamas. Even if the agreement ultimately is reached, responsibility for the deaths of thousands of Palestinians in this time, and those Israeli hostages who could still have been saved 6 months ago, lies with the outgoing Biden administration inter alia. Mr. President, the Russian Federation's position in principle in Middle East resolution remains unchanged, and this is in alignment with the will of the international community. We consistently advocated and continue to advocate an unconditional ceasefire, unfettered humanitarian access, the release of all hostages and forcibly detained persons, the relaunch of the peace process on the well-known international legal basis, at the heart of which lies the two states for two peoples principle. Naturally, the Israelis have the right to provide for their own security. However, the path to achievement of this objective lies exclusively through a comprehensive process of Middle East settlement and the realization of the legitimate right of the Palestinians to their own state within the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital. This is the only way that not only can a lasting peace be achieved between Palestinians and Israelis, but the only way to eradicate the root cause of the escalation of violence, whose repercussions have already spiraled out far beyond the occupied Palestinian territory, destabilizing the situation throughout the entire Middle East region. Thank you for your attention.
Gaza, death continues to cast its shadow, and the bombings and attacks by Israel do not cease even for a moment. For the people in Gaza, they were not counting down for the happy celebration of the new year, but the next bombing that can happen anytime. Right before the new year, a heinous tragedy took place in northern Gaza. The Israeli force launched an attack on Kamal Adwan Hospital, the only remaining comprehensive medical service institution in northern Gaza, forcibly detaining medical and care personnel, forcibly transferring innocent patients, causing the deaths of a large number of people, and plunging the hospital into a sea of fire. This act seriously violates international law, and in particular international humanitarian law. It is appalling, and China strongly condemns this. It is not the first time that the Kamal Adwan Hospital has been attacked, nor is it the only hospital in Gaza that has been attacked. According to the OHCHR report, only by June 2024, at least 27 hospitals and 12 medical institutions in Gaza have been subject to 136 attacks, which claim the lives of over 500 medical personnel. Protecting the safety of medical facilities in armed conflict is a bottom line under international humanitarian law. Without sufficient evidence proving that medical facilities have become hostile facilities, deliberately launching large-scale and indiscriminate attacks against medical institutions that cause casualties of innocent civilians violates international humanitarian law and could constitute war crimes. There is also analysis indicating that the lethal attacks launched by Israel against the medical institutions in Gaza to bring the medical system in Gaza to the brink of collapse is part of the systematic strategy to make Gaza uninhabitable. China expresses its grave concerns over and strong opposition to this. We urge Israel to effectively abide by its IHL obligations, stop turning hospitals into battlefields, stop launching attacks on medical facilities, ensure the safety of medical institutions and personnel, and release all medical personnel detained. President, the conflict in Gaza has already caused unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe and civilian casualties. As the conflict enters its 15th month and comes to the beginning of 2025, ending the conflict and restoring peace remain the most pressing matter, and a duty whose fulfillment has been delayed by the Security Council for too long. The country concerned repeatedly claims that a ceasefire agreement will soon be reached. Yet the reality is continued killing and death. I wish to stress that differences in negotiations should be bridged by political will and not be filled with innocent lives. Winning the war doesn't necessarily mean owning peace, and resorting only to military strength does not guarantee lasting security. China urges Israel to heed the strong calls of the international community and immediately stop all acts of military adventurism. China calls upon Israel to lift restrictions on humanitarian access for Gaza, stop implementing and revoke promptly the bills against the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, and guarantee safety and facilitation for UNRWA and other humanitarian agencies to carry out their assistance. China supports the Security Council in fulfilling its responsibility in maintaining international peace and security and in taking all necessary actions to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza, alleviate the humanitarian disaster, and implement the two-state solution to respond to the expectations of the international community. Thank you, President.
I would like to begin by congratulating you on acceding to the presidency of the Security Council, and you know that you can count on the full support of France. I'd also like to welcome the 5 new members to this council. And finally, I would like to thank Mr. Turk and Dr. Peppercorn and Dr. Haj Hassan for their briefings. The Palestinians in Gaza continue after 14 months of conflict to suffer from living conditions that are depriving them of everything. France once again calls for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. That is really the only way to protect the civilian population and deliver the humanitarian assistance that this population needs to such a great extent. We call for the immediate release without condition of all detainees, and we will never relent in condemning the terrorist attacks of the 7th of October. Resolutions of the Security Council must be applied. The extreme seriousness of the situation is incumbent upon us to do this. The situation in Gaza is disastrous, particularly with regard to access to care. France condemns the recent Israeli military operations targeting several hospitals, in particular that of Kamal Adwan. Israel must obey international humanitarian law. This requires respect for and protection of medical staff and infrastructure. Hindrances to humanitarian assistance are serious violations of international humanitarian law. Israel must allow humanitarian access to reach the population. All crossing points should be open, and humanitarian convoys and staff must be protected. We would also recall the irreplaceable, let me repeat that, irreplaceable nature of UNRWA in providing the humanitarian response in Gaza. Mr. President, this Council must act both to respond to the urgency of the situation and to work to bring about a political solution, the two-state solution that today is being threatened by the accelerated illegal settlement of the West Bank. France will be playing its part. We will be co-chairing next June, alongside Saudi Arabia, an international conference on the implementation of the two-state solution. We will remain mobilized within the Security Council to contribute to this solution.
À même de garantir
The only solution that will guarantee the long-term security for Israel and make it possible to build a viable state for the Palestinians. And we call for the establishment of a reformed Palestinian Authority able to govern throughout the Palestinian territories, including in the Gaza Strip. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement.
President, we're all horrified by the deterioration of the healthcare situation in Gaza. It is completely unacceptable that since the 7th of October, many medical facilities have been destroyed or damaged. Over 1,000 medical personnel have been killed, injured, or detained. And, as Dr. Hassan reminded us, their SOS calls have been ignored. Following the forcible evacuation of Kamal Adwan Hospital, there are now no functioning hospitals in North Gaza Governorate. Deteriorating access to medical services across Gaza is compounding acute child malnutrition, the risk of imminent famine, and the spread of infectious diseases. As we face this devastating situation, the UK reiterates three key and fundamental demands. First, we call for civilians and medical staff to be protected in line with international humanitarian law. Israel is responsible for ensuring that civilians have access to vital medical care and for enabling medical practitioners to operate safely. The UK continues to urge Israel to abide by their international obligations, including those set out in Security Council Resolution 2286. And we also call on Israel to clarify the whereabouts of medical staff detained from hospitals in the north. We are aware of reports of Hamas using civilian infrastructure for their operations, including hospitals. The UK strongly condemns such actions. By embedding themselves in civilian infrastructure, Hamas clearly put Palestinian civilians and medical staff at risk. We reiterate, however, that obligations under IHL to protect hospitals and healthcare workers are unconditional. President, second, UNRWA must be allowed to play its essential role, including in delivering medical services. And we unequivocally reject attempts to undermine its mandate. On the 11th of December, my Prime Minister committed an additional $16.5 million to UNRWA to support vital services, including for medical care. The UK is also supporting provision of essential healthcare, including through funding to UK Med to run a field hospital and provide other healthcare services in Gaza. President, third, Israel must do much more to immediately address this crisis, and both sides must finally end this war. The UK will keep pushing for an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages cruelly detained by Hamas, for the better protection of civilians, for more aid consistently entering Gaza, and for a path to long-term peace and stability. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. Give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Mr. President, The Middle East stands today at a critical juncture. With continued Houthi attacks against civilians in Israel and in the Red Sea, Syria's precarious position following the fall of the brutal Assad regime, the ongoing firing of rockets by Hamas, again just yesterday at Be'eri, where Israeli civilians were massacred on the 7th of October 2023, and 100 hostages still being held captive by Hamas terrorists. The presidency called for an emergency session today, not to deal with these threats and challenges, and not to condemn terrorists blatantly violating international law by exploiting hospitals as the basis of military activity. Such actions negatively impact the credibility of the Council and the international system. Hospitals are meant to be sanctuaries of care and compassion. Yet Hamas has transformed them into tools for terror, exploiting their sanctity to shield its murderous aims and wage war against civilians. This is not an isolated tactic or an act of desperation. This is a deliberate and systematic strategy, a cornerstone of Hamas's operational doctrine, their modus operandi. Though we have known this for many years, the past 15 months have exposed the depth of Hamas's depravity. In November 2023, IDF troops exposed a 55-meter-long terror tunnel, 10 meters deep underneath the Shifa hospital complex, along with massive caches of weapons throughout the tunnel and the hospital. In that same month, at the Indonesian hospital, IDF forces identified a white Toyota truck used during the massacre of October 7th, located within the hospital compound. Additionally, a vehicle with an Israeli license plate and bloodstains, later linked to a hostage, was found in the hospital area. In February 2024, the IDF uncovered a network of terror tunnels connecting the Turkish hospital in Gaza City to nearby operational facilities. These tunnels allowed Hamas operatives to move weapons and personnel discreetly, all the while exposing and exploiting the civilian infrastructure of the hospital. In March 2024, the IDF revealed dozens of weapons, millions of dollars in blood money, and hundreds of operatives once again inside Shifa Hospital. We found further video footage proving that Hamas took hostages to Al-Shifa following the October 7th attack, and that the hostage Noah Marciano was murdered by a Hamas terrorist within the hospital walls. Just 4 days ago, on December 30th, Hamas operatives were caught on camera planting explosives a mere 45 meters from the Indonesian hospital in northern Gaza. And now, Kamal Adwan Hospital has become the latest site exploited by Hamas, a grim addition to their well-documented and public history of abusing civilian infrastructure. This council must confront this undeniable reality. Hamas does not respect the sanctity of hospitals, schools, or places of worship. It uses them to protect its terrorists, store its weapons, and launch its attacks. It uses civilian population as human shields, playing on the instinct to protect the vulnerable. At Kamal Adwan Hospital, Hamas turned a facility for healing into a command center for terror. Since October 2024, following an IDF operation in the area, Hamas entrenched itself in the hospital, embedding its military infrastructure and operational hubs within its walls. Despite repeated calls by Israel to cease the unlawful military use of the hospital since the start of the operation in October, these warnings were again ignored and disregarded. This week's precise operation by the IDF revealed the extent of Hamas's abuse of the facility. Over 240 terrorists were apprehended, including 15 who participated in the October 7th massacre, the darkest day in Israel's modern history, where over 1,200 lives were brutally taken by the terrorists. Among those apprehended was the hospital director himself, who is suspected of being a Hamas operative, as hundreds of Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists were hiding inside the Kamal Adwan hospital under his management. He is currently being investigated by Israeli security forces. Colleagues, this operation was not a choice, it was a necessity. It was conducted based on extensive intelligence gathered over months, confirming Hamas's activities on hospital premises. In accordance with international humanitarian law, the IDF has implemented comprehensive measures to mitigate harm to civilians. Prior to this operation, Israel facilitated the evacuation of 350 patients, caregivers, and medical staff from the hospital, along with the delivery of tens of thousands of liters of fuel, hundreds of food parcels, and critical medical supplies to sustain hospital operations. As the operation progressed, an additional 95 patients, staff and caregivers were safely transferred to the Indonesian hospital. This included the provision of 5,000 litres of fuel, 2 generators, and essential medical equipment to maintain the critical systems and ensure uninterrupted care. Israel continues to cooperate with the international community to strengthen the medical response capabilities at the Indonesian hospital. Additionally, the IDF worked with the director of Kamal Adwan Hospital to ensure the facility was vacated from patients and other civilians prior to the commencement of its precise operation. The operation uncovered caches of weapons, including grenades, firearms, ammunition, and other military equipment hidden within the hospital grounds. As IDF forces operated nearby, they faced attacks from Hamas operatives firing anti-tank missiles and RPGs. This is the stark contrast between Israel and Hamas. While Hamas endangers civilians, Israel protects them, even at the risk of our own personnel's lives. Hamas's exploitation of hospitals is not only a moral abomination, but a blatant violation of international law, and far too often, the international response has been silence. On October 17, 2023, when an explosion rocked Al Ali Hospital, many in this chamber and around the world rushed to pass judgment, parroting casualty figures provided by Hamas terrorists. Those numbers were grossly inflated, and the explosion was caused not by Israel, but by a misfired Islamic Jihad rocket. Yet the damage was done. Hamas's propaganda had achieved its goal. This council cannot afford to repeat those mistakes. It must not allow itself to be manipulated by those who weaponize the truth. It must maintain its dignity and credibility. Israel's actions exemplify its commitment to international humanitarian law and principles. Despite the challenges of protecting itself against an enemy that hides behind civilians, Israel continues to uphold its obligations. Over the past month alone, Israel has facilitated the medical evacuation of over 1,000 patients and caregivers from Gaza for life-saving treatments in 13 countries. These efforts reflect a fundamental truth. Even as it faces relentless terror, Israel remains committed to preserving life. Distinguished Council members, the issue at hand extends beyond Israel and Hamas. It strikes at the heart of international norms and the principles that govern this Council. If hospitals can be turned into terror bases without consequences, if civilians can be used as shields with impunity, what does that say about the state of international law? What message does this send to other terror groups around the world? This is a test, not just for Israel, but for the Council and for the global community. Will we stand by as the sanctity of medical institutions is eroded? Will we allow Hamas to set a precedent where the protection of civilians becomes a shield for terror? This Council must act decisively. It must condemn Hamas's actions in the strongest terms. It must recognize that Israel's operations are not only a response to terror, but offense to the principles that underpin this institution. Israel will continue to protect its citizens, uphold its commitments under international law, and do all it can to bring the hostages home. But the Council must meet its own obligations. It must protect the innocent, fight for the release of the hostages alongside us, uphold the rule of law, and hold accountable those who seek to weaponize human suffering and civilian infrastructure. I thank you.